Kia ora, good morning. Welcome to Winning the Green Premium, our webinar series for New Zealand's sustainable food and fibre exporters, brought to you by the Value Project and New Zealand Trade and Enterprise. Ko Vincent Heeringa, aho. I'm a writer and a journalist. I'm very interested in this topic, have been for some years, and I'll be your host for the next 3 episodes. So thank you for joining us, Ngā mihi, and welcome. This series attempts to answer a big question for New Zealand food producers, which is kind of basically this, and this is Paul's question, I know. We know that consumers are demanding ever greater sustainability from their food, whether it's animal ethics and labour rights and environmental protections and so on. And that's lovely, but it all comes with a cost. And who carries that cost? Who's going to pay our growers and our producers and our manufacturers for the extra cost burden that comes with producing food sustainably? And in this series, we're going to explore how Kiwi brands are doing that, not just in theory doing that, but are actually winning the green premium. And they are working with their suppliers, with their growers and producers, with the distributors, with their communities, and ultimately with their end consumers to win that green premium and pass that value back along the value chain. This series is rooted in research that has been funded by Our Land and Water, called Rewarding Sustainable Practices, which explored the power of value chains and partnerships to really create value at the consumer end and then bring that back and distribute it to all the partners in the chain. And it studied some of New Zealand's top businesses to really identify what are the contributions that a value chain can make in rewarding sustainable practices. Of course, this is super relevant at the moment, and we want to acknowledge the loss and the suffering of many of our colleagues and friends in the North Island because of Cyclone Gabrielle. And it kind of really brings to the fore, doesn't it, the importance of resilience in our food systems. The fallout of that storm is yet to be understood and fully known. And so we're really cognizant of this discussion happening in the context of a tremendous loss. So we acknowledge that and we wish those people who are helping once again today, cleaning up and dealing with the aftermath, all the best from, it's easy to say, here in the comfort of our studio in Christchurch. Right, well, on to our first episode. So once again, thanks for joining us. This episode's about the beverage industry, and we're joined by 3 people who are real leaders in beverage brand making and value creation. And I'll just quickly introduce our panel. We have Florence van Dyke, who is she is a co-founder of Chia Sisters, a very successful drinks company out of Nelson. She also wears another hat, which we'll hear about in a minute. She is the first head of sustainability for New Zealand Trade and Enterprise. We're joined by Patsy Bass, who is the co-founder. Would you describe yourself as co-founder? Founder of Reefton Distilling Co., which you may well have enjoyed a little bitty gin, and we're going to enjoy some whiskey very soon. Thanks, Patsy, for joining us. Simon Coley, who is a co-founder of Karma Drinks, Karma Cola, one of our favourite drinks, and all good organics as well, which brings in the ethical bananas. And also Paul Dalziel, who is a professor of economics at the Agribusiness and Economics Research Unit, which sits inside Lincoln University, very close to here, but is its own independent research house and has done a lot of the mahi around the kind of the thinking that this is based on. So all of you, kia ora, good morning, atamarie, thanks for joining us.
Yeah.
The gremlins continue as the microphone falls out my ear. Look, we're just going to rip straight into it. I'm going to go to Florence. Florence, thank you for joining us. And you wear, I think, at least 3 hats today. You're a beverage entrepreneur in your own right. You've studied sustainability at Stanford University, and you're also the head of sustainability at New Zealand Trade and Enterprise. So my question for you, Florence, is there a green premium?
Thanks, Vincent. Ngā mihi nui for having me on this awesome webinar. And yes, I mean, to answer your question simply, I think there certainly is. And we've felt that at Chia Systems, and all the data and real-time examples coming out of New Zealand Trade and Enterprise is showing that as well. And I think specifically in our export markets, this exists in some of those core markets that we're exporting to, so the likes of the UK, Japan, US, Australia, China, and we're really seeing it across almost all food, beverage, and consumer goods.
Mm-hmm.
And one thing that I think is really interesting about the research that we're seeing is that there is an increasing willingness to pay that green premium, where there was definitely a jump during COVID, and there's been another jump in the last 12 months. And I find that particularly interesting because there's been so much happening in the last 12 months. There's been inflation, delays due to supply chain disruptions. There's been, the rising cost of energy, particularly overseas. But despite all that, people care more about the planet, or are more likely to align those values about caring for the planet with their spending power. And so I think that shows that this is more than a trend. It's really here to stay through economic cycles, which is pretty exciting.
And you think that New Zealand is well placed to capture that? Do we have a brand that can sustain that kind of message?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we have a huge platform on the world stage. We're known as a values-based economy. There's some recent Boston Consulting Group research that showed that. And I think that, we do need to actually take action, though. It's not enough just to rest on our laurels and on maybe a clean, green image that we have had for a long time. We do need to take action, but we're certainly very well placed to do that.
Okay, great. Well, we might come back to some of that brand positioning, but Paul, I want to give you an opportunity to tell us about the research, because the research that this is based on has really deep roots into consumer understanding, doesn't it? Could you just tell us a little bit about that program?
The research started when we realised that producers in New Zealand were delivering some outstanding regard to the natural environment, reinvestment into their local community, cultural authenticity, but they weren't really being rewarded for that commitment, for that work, because they weren't profiling what they were embodying in their products to international consumers. And so the purpose of the research was to find those consumers in global markets that shared the same values, the care for the planet, the care for local community, the care for cultural authenticity, as well as tasting good and having all of those things that you associate with quality food, and then creating the value chain that would connect those consumers with New Zealand producers so that the value could be created and captured for the people who were doing the work.
You tell a lovely story of standing inside, I think, a Tesco's or a Sainsbury and looking for New Zealand lamb.
And there was the New Zealand lamb shrink wrapped on the bottom shelf, relatively cheap compared to some of the cuts from the rest of Europe. But all of the quality that goes into producing Canterbury lamb was invisible to the consumer. And so how can we raise the profile of quality food and beverages sourced from Aotearoa, New Zealand, so that it finds the market where consumers are willing to pay a premium for that quality?
I guess it starts really in the consumer's mind, doesn't it? About you identified these things called credence values. What do you mean by that?
Well, I can't say we identified those. This is an international term to describe the values embodied in a beverage that the consumer has to take on trust. So when they buy that drink and the label claims that it's sustainably grown, that it's carbon zero, that they're paying living wages, the consumer can't check all of that in the supermarket. They have to take it on trust.
Right.
And so this is what we mean by credence attributes, but they can double the price of a commodity compared to the same product in the cabinet next door.
That those credence values align often with sustainability values, don't they? And why is that? What is that an accident that those two things come
Well,
together?
we're talking about food and beverages. And so everybody, I think, knows food and beverages. We are talking about the environment. You know, these are natural products grown. They worry about the air quality. They worry about the water quality. They worry about all of these things as part of food safety concerns. So if I see this supplier is looking after their local environment, I can trust that the food I'm buying is safe to drink. And so it's a big signal. If I care for the environment, if I care for the local consumer, then I'm caring for the international consumer, and I can buy this product with confidence.
Right. And that's why you talk about value chains rather than just say branding, because all of that, those values need to be backed up by the reality, don't they, of
That's right.
Proven growing methods, certified, independently assessed practices.
Yes, and New Zealand's history is that we created supply chains. So we had guaranteed markets first in the United Kingdom and then in China, where if we produced a quality product to specification, we had a market ready to buy it.
Right.
But now we're moving to value chains where we are telling our own story. This is the value that you are buying when you purchase food and beverages made in New Zealand.
And your point is that a lot of those values are there, and they, you know, we're getting better.
Yes.
We're not great, but we're getting better.
Yes.
And what we haven't been doing is articulating that and capturing that in the way that the supply chain is coming back, or is now creating value rather than just a mere supply chain.
That was certainly true 10 years ago. I think, you know, the leaders around this table are examples of what entrepreneurs in New Zealand are doing now,
right,
where we are becoming much more confident in telling our story on the world stage and finding that it resonates.
Yep.
There are consumers that we can find who really love the New Zealand story and love the authenticity in that story. And we have to work hard to protect it because it's a huge asset in the journey forward.
Okay. Simon, again, thanks for joining us. What are people buying when they buy a Karma drink? And I think they're probably paying a premium over the competitor. Maybe that's the first question. Is Karma, would you describe it as a premium? And if it is, what are they buying? What are they paying more for?
Look, if we, premium means superior quality and a higher price, we definitely fit those criteria. You know, our bananas sell for $1 more than the average conventional bunch of bananas in a supermarket. All of our products have a higher price, and we believe better quality. I think our real challenge has been that, you know, we can encourage people to try our products for the first time. Novelty is quite a good way of selling something. If they haven't seen something like it before, we're kind of hardwired to notice that difference. But getting repeat purchase, getting loyalty takes a lot more than the look of the package and the taste of the product. That's kind of our right of admission to any of these markets. And we've made the probably foolhardy challenge of our business is to take on some pretty large competitors.
Can't think of who they might be in the cola business.
We've been moderately successful at it. We're nowhere near as big as those competitors in any of the markets we're working in, but we have found that our way of doing this has resonated, and our learning has been that you can, you know, as founders of our companies, the difference that makes our brand unique and distinctive is pretty much the reason we're in business, because we care. So the three of us that founded both of those companies, Chris, Matt, and myself, you know, have a strong interest in the provenance of the ingredients we use to produce our drinks and our bananas and our oat milk. And we believe in the sustainability of what we're doing and the ethics behind it in terms of, you know, labor justice and the work that we're doing with growers in places like Ecuador and Sierra Leone and Samoa. But not a lot of customers care about that. You know, to be honest about it, if you ask someone if they'll buy an organic product, they'll probably say yes. But if you observe them purchasing, they may not, unless it's visible. So we have a job to do to tell the story and to make sure that they feel good about being seen with our product. It's probably not surprising that we have more success in the very visible occasions that people consume our products, like aside from bananas, like our drinks in cafes and restaurants, because there is something to do with virtues signaling around what we're associated with, because we've told that story. I guess the way to think about it for us has been what we've learned on that journey. And there's an experience I had in the first time we had a trade show in the UK, with watching people approach our stand and see a bottle of Karma Cola for the first time. And because they'd all had 4 or 5 cups of coffee, they were ready for something different. And we were sort of at the back of this hall, and they saw that, we weren't selling coffee. They saw the label and were kind of attracted to the design of the drinks. They had a taste, as soon as someone caught our attention, we'd give them a sample. And, the best thing we heard was, oh, it tastes like cola, because that's been established by a brand that's much bigger than us. That taste is almost a sort of piece of psychic real estate that we're trying to sneak into. But then they'd see what we were doing to make it. We'd have cola nut there from West Africa, from Sierra Leone. We had video of Albert Tucker, who's chairman of our foundation that helps us work with the villages that we get these ingredients from in Sierra Leone. And there was this sort of penny dropping where they went, oh, but what is that? What has that got to do with the drink that I'm looking at and tasting? And when that connection was made around provenance, around the fact that they knew of this thing and never understood that it was an actual ingredient that came from somewhere, we'd have this little fishhook that would stick in their memory. And that's the power of being able to explain what Paul describes as a value chain to someone, so it sticks with them and gives them that currency. Like, we wouldn't be able to do what we do without a large community of people who've had that experience. It's not all our customers, it's a small percentage of them, but they're the ones that advocate and become our advertising, if you like.
What you've described,
so without that conviction, we don't really have a market. We've got to be able to prove it. I could go into the way of doing that, but that's pretty much it in a nutshell. We need to look good, taste good, and then do good, and prove that we do good.
Almost like a triangle, isn't it? The pointy end was all the things we're used to: great taste, great packaging. Well, it's a funky brand. But as you sort of draw people into your universe, they start to identify and emotionally connect with your growers and the foundation and the values that you've tried to imbue in these brands, right? Is that a good way? Is a triangle a good way to describe it?
Like I say, we care about that more than most people, but when it gets through, it creates a very strong connection, and that's kind of our approach. If we can convert more people because they believe in what we do, that will grow. And it's kind of what we're seeing. Steady, not sensational, but steady growth through that community of consumers.
I see you're sitting in a garage, not a super yacht.
Yes. No, yeah. One day.
Nice bookshelf.
I'll have another bike in my garage.
Patsy, people have connected so much with Reefton Distilling Co., haven't they? Why? What have you tapped into?
I think the magic that I've always known. Oops, are we?
Oh, that's good. Yep. Carry on. Yep.
The magic I've always known that was in the hills in Reefton. It's a pretty special community in town, and look, we set up because of the authenticity and the provenance and what we had before we even knew what the product was. It just happened to be a distillery in the end. That was the vehicle that enabled us to revitalise a town, or play a part in revitalising a town. And I spent 3 months on the main street talking to visitors, saying, why are you here? What do you like? What don't you like? And what would you like to see? And Reefton is nestled in a native rainforest. So everywhere you look, you're looking at fresh native botanicals. The first thing people have said to me my whole life when I say that I'm from the West Coast is, oh, it always blooming rains on the West Coast. Well, they clearly haven't been there in summer. And we thought, well, with all this beautiful pristine water and all these native botanicals, you make gin.
And so it's kind of interesting what you're saying, that the vehicle was the distillery, but it could have been another product.
Absolutely.
Right? Because what you're talking about is an emotional connection to a place.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, if I'd had my way, it would have been a business to do with gold because I was a non-drinker at the time. So to now own a distillery is a wee bit surreal. But yeah, it was, and people, whether they visit there, whether they've fallen in love with the imagery or tasted the product, there is a connection there that keeps bringing people back, and they feel like they're part of the family or the journey. So we get a lot of people that have made the trip to Reefton that had never otherwise been to the West Coast because of, reading it in a magazine, or tasting it at a friend's place.
That's interesting. So there are a lot of gins now. How many gins are available on the market?
When we started, there were about 35, and I would say we're heading towards 200 now. Like New Zealand gins, there'd be 160 plus.
Wow. And presumably quite a few international gins as well.
Oh, oodles. I think there are over 600 in Australia alone.
And do you think that this Reefton connection is what gives you the point of difference, or is it taste, or is it
I think
price,
in New Zealand, it's West Coast. It's the gutsy small town doing something that sort of surprised. But as soon as we go offshore, it's brand New Zealand. It's not brand Reefton or brand West Coast.
Because
So
people wouldn't know the difference between West Coast.
it could be the West Coast of America, or
yeah, interesting. Paul, there's some really interesting insights there around values and connections, and even connection to whenua. Is this is the kind of thing you were discovering, right, in your case studies?
It was the main thing we discovered. So we started expecting to find value, as an economic value, being created and captured along a value chain. But when we interviewed people like those around the table about their businesses, the word that came through was values rather than value. And the value was created out of the shared values. And so these companies, these entrepreneurs are not trying to feed the world. They are establishing a connection with a particular consumer or a consumer type who shares the values embodied in the product, and trying to create that emotional connection so that the consumer sees the values embodied in the product and are willing to pay the value of producing those values.
Right. What are those values? Patsy, what matters to you as a founder, someone that's still driving the business? What are the things that you care about?
So it's about the environment. It's about the social responsibility. So we set this up for the town, not in the town. It's about doing the right thing so that, I was really fortunate. I worked with Ngāi Tahu for quite some time. So that instilled in me an intergenerational focus. So we've set up a business with a 100-year vision, not a how does Shane and I get rich quick and move on.
Right. Yeah. Fantastic. Tell us about the involvement with the town. On your website, there's this wonderful picture of your foundational shareholders, and they look like your neighbours, possibly.
Many are. So when we set up, we ring-fenced a number of shares for the local community, because even though I'm a local, I was born in Reefton, I didn't want to come into town and just do this thing there. So we had people who didn't even have a computer that would help to get signed up, that had never invested before, that took, sort of a $1,500 shareholding in the company. So they've learned and been on that journey with us.
Interesting. Florence, Chia sisters, what mattered to you when you were setting it up? What did you care about?
For us, our big values are innovation, nutrition, and sustainability. And we made a decision from the outset of our business that every time we were going through a major business decision, those three values would have a seat at the table. So one example of that is when we shifted into our own factory. So we went from having a contract manufacturer to making the product ourselves. And we decided when we did that to line our new factory with solar panels. And that was quite expensive, but when we did that, we launched a new range called Bottled by the Sun to celebrate that shift to solar power. And the profits from that range far outweigh, the cost of the solar panels. So it's a good example of being more ethical, providing more profit at the end of the day.
That's a lovely example. Simon, one of your values, I know, is this sort of returning to the community, particularly the growers, right, of cocoa beans. Tell us about how you do that.
We started this thing with the unrealistic expectation that we would be able to do something constructive there, and then thought, Christ, we've not been involved in developing resources and communities in this part of the world ever before. So how do we figure that out?
This is in Sierra Leone, not famous for,
yes.
Famous for all the wrong reasons.
Not from international interventions anyway, but what we thought we'd better do was ask. So with Albert's help, we talked to all of the leaders and the people in the villages and said, what do you need? If we are able to make money from selling your produce or from transforming it into cola and then the revenue from that, what would you like with it, us to help you do? And unfortunately, part of the selection of the village was about us knowing there was a group within the community that could manage this and make sure we had a reasonably fair way of distributing that. And the chiefs in Boma and a couple of other villages came back and said, we'd really like to see young women get to school, because, mostly within the culture there, it's boys that get the first dibs at education and girls become sort of wives and don't have much opportunity to get beyond the sort of norm within those societies. But they saw, because there are many women chiefs there, that it would be really good to be able to open up this opportunity. So we had no problem with that and went straight into setting up these scholarships. They also asked for infrastructure, which we've been able to over time help them build. So we'd all usually have a policy where we go, we'll provide some money, but we expect some from the community and some from government. So we've set up these sort of public-private partnerships to make these things happen. So it's mostly been about us understanding how we can, we do try and tell these stories in order to get more business, to sell our story, if you like, to sell our product. And as we speak, Albert is on his way to Sierra Leone to deliver a truck that he's just bought in Freetown to the villages so that they can get crops to market without having to carry them on the back of step-through bikes. So we've, it wasn't something we'd immediately think of, but because we have such a strong relationship with them, they've been able to help guide us into the sort of things we can do to help them.
When you're talking about that, I'm just thinking, I'm seeing cost. I'm seeing cost in building schools and bridges and buying trucks and so on. And there must be an easier way to make money for a start. What's the incentive to continue to have these costs in your business? Like, why does it work for Karma?
Well, the thing is, we made this commitment. We probably couldn't call ourselves Karma unless we had the evidence that Paul was talking about.
You mean the hint might be in the name?
Yeah. So that's either a restraint or an opportunity, and we still struggle with some of it. We also have a lot of other certifications, and we're currently looking at them going, where do we derive, like in a very commercial sense, the most value? And honestly, the thing that differentiates us is that foundation. It's the one thing that we could never do without. We use a lot of other third parties to help us prove us and substantiate these claims around sustainability, reduction in carbon to neutralize our carbon debt, social justice, fair trade, quality of ingredients. So, if we look at all of them, the thing we come back to that really helps our brand as Karma Drinks is that relationship with producers. I think it's very similar to what Patsy's talking about, and that the more you connect what goes on behind the scenes with consumers that are supporting that purchase through everything else, after you've impressed them with the look of your bottle and given them the delight of the taste, that loyalty, I think, comes from knowing if they do it again, that effect is almost massive. It just, it keeps getting better and better. The challenge for telling that story, we can't, sort of overtake social media or buy in a conventional way that attention from people. So we really have to rely on the strength of the idea and the story and the sort of thing that Florence is talking about. If you make it known to those really strong advocates that you've done something in this way that's very constructive, like solar powered drinks, then I think your differentiator's much easier to share.
Right.
So that story can be told by other people.
Patsy and Florence
have that.
They're not nodding vigorously. Patsy, you've got this sort of loyal base, haven't you, that are interested in, and they kind of do your marketing in some ways.
They do the word of mouth. That we've got over 400 shareholders who are brand ambassadors for us, and look, one of the examples is when we very first started, and I rang a distributor, and he sort of went, "Oh, here's another call, second one today," and he said, "Look, you won't sell gin in New Zealand for that price, all these things that wouldn't work." And so we did it anyway. And a few months later, he rang me laughing, going, "My goodness, you're smashing it, little biddies. The number 2 New Zealand gin in the country. It's the story. People can't get enough of it."
That's so interesting. Florence, is that your experience with, I don't know, with the solar powered drinks?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, more than ever before, consumers are really looking for honesty and transparency. And I think at Chia Sisters, we're very clear about the fact that we're not perfect, no business is. But if you can show that you're taking a stand on something that reflects your values, and then really honestly and transparently show your action in doing that, I think that's something that's resonating with consumers more and more.
Yeah, that's interesting. Paul, kind of what you're saying is we don't have to have all the world. We just have to have the people, find the people that care.
Yes. So New Zealand Trade and Enterprise have launched a whole campaign around the words "made with care." And this is the stories that we're hearing in this webinar, is that the producers care not just for the food safety in their product, but they care about their local community. They care about the global environment. They care about the authenticity of the cultural values that they are expressing in the whole value chain. And I think that's something about the Kiwi way, that when we come to food and beverages, it's been part of our culture for so long. We are very unusual as a country for the percentage of our exports that are around food and beverages. And so these stories of artisan producers who are making products with care that they are selling around the world is a huge part of the New Zealand identity. And it's just building upon itself now as that reputation grows.
Yeah. Florence, what opportunities exist? We've got 3 really successful companies here and there's just so many more. I know Paul studied Connell Wines, for instance, from Wakatu Incorporation, another really successful story that's sort of based out of origin and provenance and connection to people and land, which is, we will get them on another webinar, I hope. But Florence, just looking forward, and if people are watching this and saying, geez, I'd love to get into the beverage business, or I'd like to do more, as a trade and enterprise person, what do you see?
Yeah, absolutely. I think to Paul's point, we're absolutely seeing that volume to value to values, and that's where businesses, and specifically food and beverage export businesses, are gaining the most value. I think one really macro trend that I'm seeing, not necessarily specifically to beverages, but I find quite interesting, is businesses, well, I guess with public viewing businesses as societal leaders. So in the US now, there's more trust in business than there is in media or even the government, which is absolutely crazy, but it means that there's this expectation that businesses should be taking a stand on these social and environmental issues. And I saw that a lot in the US, and it was interesting to see that a bit closer to home in Australia recently with the Australia Day boycotts. And when the public was boycotting Australia Day because it represents the invasion of Australia, it wasn't the government that took a really public stand. It was actually businesses that stood up and said that their employees could take off any day that they chose to, that best represented their values. And the employers that didn't do that, they had a huge backlash from their employees, which is not something the businesses can afford with the current labour shortages. So yeah, that's sort of a macro trend I'm seeing, is businesses standing up as leaders on these issues, and an expectation from consumers for that.
That's interesting. Is there something also you tapped into chia seeds, which were kind of this, in some ways, a sort of unknown product? Are there other unknown berries, interesting kind of flavors that we could explore as an industry?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think functional health is huge at the moment, and looking at what provides health benefits and nutrition and the actual science-based impacts of that on the body. And I think there's a real opportunity in New Zealand to do this with Indigenous rongoa Māori herbs, if it's done in the right way. So at the moment, we're working with Wakatoa Corporation to do some research into the benefits of kawakawa, and we have human clinical trials being undertaken with high value nutrition grants, and they're showing that kawakawa has benefits like anti-inflammatories, gut health properties, and to be able to scientifically prove that and then share that Indigenous story that Wakatoa Corporation has on the world stage. I mean, I think that's absolute gold for New Zealand, that we're just at the very start of that journey.
I don't know if, Brett, you could get Sarah to come and unlock the iPad for me, and then I can ask questions, pass on viewer questions. Patsy, you've been exploring interesting kind of things you've been finding in the bush, haven't you, for out in Reefton?
We have things like snow moss, which is actually a lichen that we gather from the forest floor, as one of those. Yeah.
Yeah, and tell me about the twins whose names I've forgotten, but they're your...
Nigel and Stephen Mackay, so they're 74 years old now, and their parents and mine were friends from about the 1940s. My brothers grew up hunting with those boys, and when we were thinking about a distillery, I bumped into them and said, "What do you think of this?" And not only did they say, "Oh, well, I said, where's the most pristine water you remember ever drinking in your years out in the hills?" And they sort of pointed and they said, "Oh, there was a spring up there." And so they went out with their old canvas backpacks and a machete, and they cleared a path to it and brought back water samples for us, which we still use in some of our products.
Awesome.
We, they took some people out that were helping us develop our first recipes, and they just gathered up a whole lot of native botanicals. And they're an absolute mine of information.
That's so interesting. Paul, one of the things that I loved learning about from your research was, value can be found in so many different places. We've touched on kind of connection to people and a place, but like taramia, for instance, which is I know we're slightly out of the beverage area, but here is a crop that is largely ignored. Right, but Ngāi Tahu found interesting uses for it.
Yeah, so that has been a tonga species for Ngāi Tahu for forever, and it is used in the making of perfumes that only the high-ranking Maori would have had access to before colonisation, and now they are thinking, how can we create a story around this product that would resonate with perfume markets around the world? And one of the things that came out of the research is that ultimately all value that producers can capture has to come from consumers. So a huge amount of the work is identifying those consumers and building a connection to those consumers who value your values. It doesn't fall out of the sky. It's very hard work.
Yeah. That's such a good point. There's a great question here about... I'll just get the name right. And by the way, we are open to questions. We've got 10 minutes for questions, so do fire them through. Alvaro Ramirez says, can only rich countries now afford to buy New Zealand products? I don't know who to put that to. Simon, can only rich people buy Karma Cola?
Well, it's not, it's like bananas too. They definitely sell at a premium, as we've discussed. So they're not we find it difficult to export, weirdly, our drinks to Sierra Leone. And in fact, you know, there, any of these soft drinks are treated as a real treat. You know, they're not ubiquitously consumed like they are in the West. So yes, to some degree, that premium comes from people who can afford to pay it. But we also see that, you know, part of the work we're doing is lifting the people who are responsible for producing a lot of these ingredients out of poverty so they can afford to be able to kind of have the lifestyles that we're used to. So there's a strange other form of karma there, the sort of reverse of the virtuous circle. And hopefully, you know, over time, those sorts of things become just more accessible. It's a tricky one because, like Florence has observed, you know, the cost of all of these qualifications is not low. So to make a product accessible, I think we're finding it more, and so with our oat milk now, we know that we can produce that at scale for a much more accessible cost. And as we develop that product and develop the opportunity with New Zealand Functional Foods, another partner we work with here, to make those products in New Zealand, we will see the cost improving and being able to provide a very sustainable alternative to the sort of carbon intensive milks that we're used to drinking. And that becomes, I think that's probably a better example of how you really do need scale for these things to create massive change. But I think the same discussion we've been having around the value chains that connect that creation, well, that transformation of raw material at a less carbon intensive cost at a higher value to consumers translates to, you know, transformational industry. So I'm very excited about the future around those particular projects because, you know, we've sort of been challenged that this does feel like a niche, and there's nothing wrong with that, but you really do want to be doing things that make larger differences.
Anyone else want to respond to that cost question? You know, suddenly we're looking like a really expensive place to buy food.
Well, I think beverages. That's the reality. We're a long way away from the large population centres of the world, and if the world is relying on New Zealand to provide its nutritional needs, the world is in big trouble. That's not our space. You know, there are food baskets around the world closer to population centres that can deliver nutrition cheaper than New Zealand can. So I don't think we should apologise that we are selling artisanal values in products to people who have the income where they can afford to buy quality food of that type. That's the space we are in. And we are honest players in the global food system. We worry about distribution of food, about food security as a country, but the production values that we embody in our products are not in that space and never could be, just because we're so far away from the rest of the world.
And one more thing just to add to that is that maybe this is about thinking more about the true cost of food. We can't just continue to produce cheap food that negatively impacts people and the planet and sell it cheap and pretend there's no other cost. There's a huge cost to our oceans, to our forests, you know, to the people that are in factories on under minimum wage doing that work. So I think it's also about, you know, Coca-Cola sells their product very cheap and they're the biggest polluter in the world of any brand. And I think there is a cost to the environment for that, and the consumer's not paying for it or seeing it, but, you know, someone is.
That's a really good point. There are two questions here that are kind of related. Nick Swallow and Dominique Touchard have talked about scale. Artisanal, all three brands that we've been talking about today probably tend towards the artisanal boutique end of the spectrum. Does that automatically imply that nothing of scale could come from New Zealand?
Well, we've just opened a new distillery so that we can scale for significant export. It's still tiny by Scottish standards, for example, but we're one of the larger in New Zealand. And, we need to realise those cost efficiencies and that to keep our, our product sustainable. The elasticity in the spirits industry, there's only so far we can go and then people just won't buy it. So we've absorbed 1 million price increases over the last 2 years.
Right.
So now it's about that scale and realising those efficiencies.
It's kind of interesting if you mentioned Scotch, because it is a scaled industry, and yet it has all of those distilleries have artisanal values, don't they? They're built out of the story of the peat and the families and so on. And yet, as an industry, it's pretty big.
It's enormous, yes. I mean, people say to us sometimes, oh, what will you do if another distillery starts on the West Coast? And I say, well, I hope we get 10. It hasn't hurt Scotland having more than one distillery.
Yeah, that's interesting. So, Paul, what we're hearing perhaps is scale is not automatically going to discount values.
No, but it is a big consideration. So we've summarized our research in a diagram called the Value Compass that the Value Project is profiling as a core part of its website. And 8 points gathered around that core proposition about values, creating and capturing value. And scale is one of those 8. You just can't get away from the economics of increasing production allows you to reduce unit costs that makes your product more affordable to a wider range of consumers. But at the same time, if you grow too fast and grow too big so that you lose your artisanal values that began the whole vision, then you lose consumers who start to move to the next cab off the block. And so this is something that producers have to worry about a lot. One of our case studies, it didn't proceed because the impact of producing a new small product on the economies of scale already being captured in the process was just too big a block. They could not overcome that hurdle. So it's a very good question and something that I'm sure keeps entrepreneurs awake at night.
Well, I'm glad that we posed the question without giving an answer, but such is life. We're getting very close to the end, and what I would quite like to do, thank you for your questions, by the way. There are more questions. I don't know if I'm going to get to them all. Well, Tiffany McIntyre says, maybe we'll just quickly try this because Tiffany is we're big fans of Tiffany. What do you find is the greatest challenge when trying to export artisanal products and connect with the consumer? So the question here is possibly about making the leap. You've talked about the connection that New Zealanders have to the West Coast. That's kind of, I won't say easy because I know you'll kick me under the table for saying that, but when you've got people that don't know the West Coast, barely know New Zealand, what do you do to overcome that?
That's brand New Zealand. So we're very early in our export journey, but the big hurdle for us is the cost to get into new markets, like the significant multi-million-dollar marketing budgets needed to really make an impact.
That's kind of your point, Simon, wasn't it? That you haven't got squillions to spend on advertising. So how do you overcome being a tiny brand from a tiny place in a big world?
There's another great Kiwi skill, and that's kind of not really, being shy of making friends in hospitality around the world. So when we launched in the UK, we basically followed anyone that we knew that was working in a cafe or a pub and got them to buy our product. And I just think that the face-to-face sales that we could do, because the same happened when I was working at 42 Below. There is a sort of X factor coming from here without blowing our own trumpet. I just think that sort of healthy naivety that somehow defines us has been quite useful, not listening to no, as Jeff Ross would have said, and being able to find some energy in that, to talk to people, make friends with them, and if they are interested in your product, then they'll probably sell it. So that's really been our route to market, is to find those people who are in positions where they can choose to buy and stock our product, and focus on them first. And once you've got that, you build a book. You can build enough outlets for distributors. It's kind of labor intensive, but it pays off in the long run.
Sounds like hand-to-hand combat.
Well, it's good fun. It's high contact, but it's the reward is pretty good too. Although you do end up drinking lots of coffee.
Well, that's not a bad thing, except for Patsy, who does not drink coffee. You can't believe it. We've turned you into a gin drinker. Maybe we could work on the coffee. In the last few minutes that remain, I'm going to ask our panelists to just reflect on, you're all sort of a few years into this journey now, and as entrepreneurs, Paul, you're going to have to pretend to be an entrepreneur. What do you know now that you wish you'd known when you started, Patsy?
Gosh, I was thinking about that. I already knew it, but I didn't appreciate what it meant. And it was the manage your growth, manage your cash flow. I thought, yeah, I know all that. You get so swept up and busy, and sometimes things can just sort of get a life of their own. So really bringing back and focusing on all those fundamentals.
Fundamentals of business, because it turns out you're not just a distiller, you're running a business.
That's dead right. Yeah. I think, and somebody said to me, the business is 80% marketing, not 80% spirits. That's where all your time needs to go, and that would be fair.
Yeah. Florence, what about you? When you started Chia Sisters, you had lots of enthusiasm, I'm sure. What are you wise to now?
I think for me, it's really living by our values and making sure we grow by those values as well. And it means, being an entrepreneur is a total roller coaster, but it means that you've really got that passion when the going gets tough, because you're doing something that you believe in. And I think on the values conversation, that's something that consumers really resonate with as well. They're not looking for perfection. They're looking for some vulnerability and honesty and transparency and action on values. So it ends up paying off as well.
Yeah, that's a lovely point, isn't it? We're not all perfect. And it's kind of one of the things actually Paul talked about in his research about actually consumers are part of your value chain. So why not include them in your conversation? And that vulnerability thing's kind of an interesting point. Yeah. Paul, what do you know now that you wish you'd known earlier?
I am an observer rather than a participant, and the big excitement of the Value Project over the last 10 years has been meeting people like those around the table and hearing them talk in their own words about their passion, about their values, about their commitment to their local community. And I grew up where, 2 pieces of toast for breakfast, a sandwich from the deli for lunch, and meat and 3 veg for dinner. Night after night after night, it was always the same. And just discovering the variety of food and beverages that artisan producers can create, and turning those meals into social occasions where the food is part of the conversation and the drink is part of the conviviality. This has been a real game changer, and I'm just so excited to be part of the Value Project and the work that we're doing around Made with Care from Aotearoa, New Zealand.
Wonderful, thank you. Simon, you get to have the last word. What do you know now that you wish you'd had?
Well, I think if I knew then what I know now, I may never have started. So
well, that was nice hearing from you, Simon Coley. Yeah.
To repeat that kind of healthy naivety, you do need a certain, kind of resilience that comes from not being prepared to be overwhelmed by the work. I think the thing I would like to have done better and still sort of strive to do is really designing our own values, their margins internally to reflect those values better. That, this is a constant balancing job for us. We're like anyone on the panel, we're feeling the effect of cost increases, of inflation, of a sort of post-COVID environment that's pretty challenging. So really being able to simplify and focus that in order to have a stronger business, to have better commercials is, our obsessive focus at the moment. And the thing that gives us energy, or gives me energy to get up the next day and do more of it, is that we do get great feedback from our customers. So I guess I didn't expect that you kind of do something like this because you think it's a good idea, but you don't really realize how much just the little things, just hearing someone say, oh, I bought one of your drinks, or seeing someone buy one still is incredibly reassuring. It's like I still get surprised by it. Oh, someone's actually out there buying it.
I can't believe it. Someone's listening to my podcast.
It's a thrill. So, hopefully that won't change. That's definitely what drives the continuing to do this.
Well, thanks everyone for sharing that. It's 10 o'clock. In fact, it's 10:01 and it's time to stop. I wish we could keep chatting because there's lots to talk about. We have recorded this session, so it's available for you to, if you suffer from insomnia, we have the cure. You could listen to it over and over. There are lots of more resources at thevalueproject.nz where you tap into some case studies, interviews. You can see Paul and Caroline's research. I want to thank our Land and Water for funding this and Trade and Enterprise for being our partner. Thank you, Florence, for joining on this mahi. Sarah Perriam, who's there looking very chilled and relaxed after a few technical difficulties. Thank you for you and your team putting this together. Thank you to my guests, Patsy Bass, Paul Dalziel, excuse me, Florence van Dyke and Simon Coley. Thank you very much for your time this morning and for all your work. And thank you to you, our guests who have joined us online, have asked questions and engaged with the Value Project and all of this discussion. Next month, we will return March the 21st to talk about the red meat sector, of which pretty important for New Zealand, and lots of interesting innovation and value being created in there. So thank you, mā te wā. Have a great week.